everyone, and welcome to our podcast series on synthetic biology.
London iGEM team of 2024, and our goal here is to release weekly podcasts you can listen to anywhere at any time on various biological topics.
So, firstly, welcome back to our podcast. And you're in for a treat today because we have two special guests with us. They also go to the City of London School for Girls, which is the same school as ours. And could you guys introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Nahida, and I take English literature, French, politics, and religious studies for A-level.
Hi, I'm Adele. I take English literature, religious studies, and history.
And just as a reminder, I'm Daru, one of your two hosts, and I take biology, chemistry, and maths A-level.
And I'm Irene, another host. I take biology, chemistry, maths, and physics. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
So let's get started with designer babies.
Daru, what does that mean?
Basically, it's an embryo that's been genetically edited to produce a child with specific traits. These traits are often things like personality, intelligence, athleticism. And while this sounds literally straight out of science fiction, if we project the quick developments in IVF technology, it seems highly possible in the future.
So to clarify, designer babies in the sense of using CRISPR to edit and take out or insert genes in embryo genomes doesn't exist?
Yes, exactly. Currently, what is available is screening existing embryos created in IVF clinics to check for genetic diseases. And some parents may then choose to not implant specific embryos that are shown to have certain genetic conditions. So guys, what do you think are the potential ethical issues with this?
Well, what makes people feel entitled to designing their children? Sure, you can be like, I want my kid to have really pretty blue eyes, or I want them to have nice blonde hair. But as you guys are biologists, you know, your phenotype, your genetics as a whole are almost entirely chance. So you're kind of ruining the natural aspect of being human and having your characteristics randomly nearly assigned to you. And it just opens a can of worms because we start with like simple little tweaks and then we end up having entire changes to the human phenotype.
Yeah, continuing on from Nahida's point of where does it end, we can to an extent understand why parents wouldn't want to bring a child into the world who's going to suffer with a terminal illness or who's going to have a premature death. But when it comes to selecting for other traits for a better quality of life, like intelligence or physical attractiveness, it starts to become a bit murky. And it also has some really unsavory ties to ideas like eugenics, and we have to make sure it doesn't sort of turn into a slippery slope there.
Could you explain what eugenics is?
Yeah, sure. So eugenics is defined as the practice or advocacy of improving the human species by selectively mating people with specific desirable hereditary traits. So it aims to reduce human suffering by sort of breeding out disease or disabilities and what we call undesirable characteristics from the human population. A really prominent example of this was the Nazis in Germany. They were eugenicists since they wanted to eradicate different communities like the Jewish and Romani people.
Wow, that's so interesting and very, very tragic. So, a very similar subject of discussion is IVF.
Could you briefly explain what that means?
Essentially, it's the fertilization of an egg cell outside the female human body. Often, sperm cells and egg cells are harvested from willing donors for fertilization to take place. The zygote develops into an embryo and is then implanted into the mother's uterus.
You're saying a zygote is just a fertilized egg, right?
Yes.
So, do you guys have any thoughts about the ethics of this?
So the main ethical issue is it morally acceptable to interfere in the reproduction process? Currently in our society, we have a pretty liberal view that women have complete autonomy over their bodies, hence the phrase, my body, my choice. However, there is a view that this can go down a slippery slope because do embryos have the rights of a person? Or do we treat, these fertilized egg cells in the same way we would treat any other human being.
And this idea that you mentioned of a woman's autonomy over her body, that argument is similarly used in discussions surrounding abortion, right?
Well, you would think so in theory, right? Like, if you're against abortion, then you're against IVF. But you'll very commonly find that the people who are against abortion aren't really against IVF. And, like, I don't mean to be political, but it does not really have strong, like, theological ties, even though you would assume so, right? But even in Alabama, where there's a bill that effectively bans abortion in the state, there are people like Senator Clyde Chambliss, who has no problem with discarding embryos produced by IVF, but he does with abortion because, in his words, the egg in the lab doesn't apply. It's not in a woman. She's not pregnant. And when you look into what he's saying, the real position, who we would coin as anti-choice people, what they are really saying isn't that every embryo is a sacred human life. It's really that every woman should choose to be pregnant and a mother. And it's this sense of conservatism, and I don't mean in a religious sense, like it might stem from religion, but it's very much like social and gender stereotypes that, according to them, good women become mothers. And IVF is fine because you're doing that because you want to have a baby. But abortion is the removal of that stereotype for women. So even though in theory these are two similar problems, when you look into how it's practiced in the world, they are actually the complete opposite.
Yeah, I mean, Nahida, that's really interesting. Because there seems to be a sort of hypocrisy there between what is really the difference between a fertilized egg cell in a mother's womb or in like a clinic. It seems to be basically the same thing. And so you'll find that there's different views on this, and perhaps a more sort of consistent view on this would be the Catholic view, which is particularly strict on IVF, unusually so compared to even other conservative views. That's because Catholics believe in the natural moral law, which is that things have a purpose. This purpose is called a telos in Greek, and so they say that for something to be moral, it must act in accordance with its telos. So it must fulfill its purpose, basically. It must act in the way that God intended it to be. So the Catholic Church says that sex has two purposes. The first purpose is procreation, and the second purpose is unity between the spouses. And for the act of sex to be moral, both of the purposes must be fulfilled in the sexual act. So since IVF separates the act of procreation from the sexual act, the Catholic Church would say that it is actually immoral.
And would you say that's a similar belief in other Christian denominations?
So there is quite a variety amongst, from a scale of conservatives to more liberal Christians. For example, the Anglican view is quite liberal and has been for a long time. They've allowed IVF since the 80s, for example.
So cool. Thank you both for sharing that. It was very impressive. But now we want to talk about the potential of those embryonic cells.
What's so special about embryonic cells is the fact that they possess a quality which we call pluripotency. And that just means that they can become many different types of cells. So when a baby is developing in the womb, its cells will turn into nerve cells or cardiac cells. Just basically, that one cell will turn into all the cells that a human body needs to survive. And that's called differentiation, or sometimes specialization.
They're gaining a lot of attention because of this quality, as scientists can use their ability to specialize into particular cells to make particular tissues. If you don't remember what we mean by tissue, go check out Season 1 released on both Spotify and YouTube right now.
We've talked a bit about this, but embryonic stem cells obviously have such a wide variety of applications, and we're all curious about what the ethics of using them are. But to set a scope for the arguments presented, let's say these embryonic stem cells are going to be used to treat type 1 diabetes, where the person's immune system has attacked the beta cells in their pancreas so that they cannot produce insulin. And then let's say stem cells have been forced to become differentiated into beta cells, which can then be transplanted into the pancreas of the patient and can produce insulin correctly.
So, as far as I understand, there's quite a diversity of views on this issue. But I'll present the Catholic view on it, which is basically that it depends on the situation.